If you ever find yourself in Kazakhstan, this large country here in Central Asia, be very careful what you post online. Because there is one topic that any comment about, even if you mean it as a joke, will ruin your life. And if you think I'm exaggerating, listen to this. Just a few weeks ago, a woman who mentioned this topic in a comment on a TikTok video was sentenced to prison for 5 years. She denied her guilt, saying her comment was just stating a historical fact and that she failed to convey her thoughts clearly, but the court disagreed and she is being held in a medium security facility until 2031. And it's not just comments on TikTok that can be extremely dangerous in Kazakhstan. In 2021, 2 women from Kazakhstan were having fun on a website called ChatRoulette that matches you with random people from around the world for an online conversation. While speaking to a man from another country, the 2 women made very brief, jokey remarks on this same topic, and both were arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. This topic is one that I cover in a lot of the videos on my channel, so if you're watching this and you're in Kazakhstan right now, stop. I'm being totally serious. Stop watching the video, delete your browsing history, and don't tell anyone that you've watched it. Right now, I mean it, seriously. I don't want you to go to prison. Okay, is everyone from Kazakhstan stop watching? Stay tuned. I'll explain. Hi everyone, I'm Fredo Rockwell, and a lot of videos on my channel cover the topic of separatism. And that is when a group of people in one country decide that either peacefully or by force, they want to leave the country that they're part of now and join another country or start their own country. The topic that's getting people in Kazakhstan sent to prison is one particular type of separatism that the authorities in Kazakhstan are extremely nervous about. Nervous enough for them to arrest and prosecute people who are only joking. Here are some recent examples, mostly from casual online comments. But the last example I'm going to give you is arguably the weirdest bit of separatist activity I've ever covered on my channel. As mentioned in the opening, after watching a TikTok video about the renaming of the city of Petropavlovsk in northern Kazakhstan, as in getting rid of its Russian language name and replacing it with a Kazakh language name, a woman identified in the media as Tatyana L left a comment that said, "Petropavlovsk is Russia, but definitely not Kazakhstan. And now they want to steal it. But never mind, everything will soon return to its place. Then we'll laugh." This comment got a lot of negative attention, and eventually Tatyana L deleted it, but not before it was noticed by Kazakhstan's National Security Committee's Department for Combating Extremism. They decided to prosecute, and a court-appointed expert concluded that the statements contained signs of propaganda aimed at violating Kazakhstan's territorial integrity. Tatyana L was found guilty under Part 2 of Article 180 of the Criminal Code, which carries a sentence of at least 5 years and a maximum of 10. Much more dangerous than leaving comments on TikTok videos, though, is having conversations on a website called ChatRoulette. ChatRoulette pairs you up with random people from around the world to have online conversations. And these random conversations have resulted in at least 3 prosecutions that I've been able to find, but there could be many more. For example, in September 2021, Tatyana Serebryakova was on ChatRoulette with her cousin. During one chat, a man from Russia asked, "Who would you like to see as president of your country out of all the presidents in the world?" Tatyana replied, "Putin." The 2 women then asked the man where he was from, and he said, "Russia." Tatyana replied,
"Заберите наш Petropavlovsk к себе, как Крым,"
which means, "Take our Petropavlovsk for your own, like Crimea." In other words, she wanted Russia to seize her part of Kazakhstan in the same way it occupied Crimea in Ukraine in 2014. Listening to Tatyana, it sounds to me like she didn't mean this as a serious comment, but this is a topic that the Kazakh authorities are extremely worried about people talking about online. Tatyana forgot about the conversation, but 2 years later, she was convicted and sent to prison. And it turns out the man they spoke to is a streamer who starts political discussions with strangers on ChatRoulette and posts them online. After 2 years, someone finally noticed the video and informed the police. There are at least 2 other instances I found of people being prosecuted and imprisoned because of conversations on ChatRoulette, in which they mention a desire for parts of Kazakhstan to be taken over by Russia. A married couple were both convicted in 2021 for remarks they made on ChatRoulette, and 2 more people were convicted for a ChatRoulette conversation in 2024. So if you like hanging out on ChatRoulette, I don't, but if that's you, and you find yourself speaking to someone from Kazakhstan, seriously, don't talk about politics. All of these examples are pretty shocking, especially if you come from a country with free speech guarantees. But even though I don't support what the Kazakh authorities are doing in these situations, I do understand their motivations. I do understand why they try and shut these conversations down, even when they're made by a bunch of people who are clearly bonkers, which is the situation in the example I'm about to tell you now. On March 19th, 2023, a group of 20 people gathered in a classroom at North Kazakhstan University College in Petropavlovsk and declared the re-establishment of the People's Soviet of Petropavlovsk. This was not a separatist move exactly. They claimed their People's Soviet was part of the unshakable territorial integrity of the sovereign Kazakh SSR, as in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, the name Kazakhstan had when it was part of the Soviet Union. From what I can see on the group's Vkontakte page, which is, bizarrely, still live, the People's Soviet was composed of conspiracy theorists from the Soviet citizen movement. Groups like this claim that the Soviet Union still exists, and that the countries like Kazakhstan, Georgia, or Belarus that supposedly gained independence in 1991 are just illegitimate corporate entities, and if you properly claim your Soviet citizenship, you can ignore them. To me, this sounds a lot like the sovereign citizen movement that is common across America and several other countries. These are people who think they can stop paying taxes or can ignore certain laws as long as when they're in front of a judge, they invoke some obscure part of common law. Much to their surprise, it never works. I suspect that the organizers of the People's Soviet were aware they were breaking the law, but, like sovereign citizens, thought that if they claimed their rights with a precise legal formula, the Kazakh authorities wouldn't be able to touch them. I don't know how else to explain their actions, which were incredibly self-destructive. They set up public social media accounts announcing their intentions weeks in advance, posted the full video of their inaugural meeting online so anyone can see it, and left their names visible on the People's Soviet Vkontakte page. But after declaring their People's Soviet, nothing happened for at least a week, and it may have seemed to these pretend Soviet citizens like everything was going exactly as they had planned. But then the video began circulating online, and by the end of March, a criminal case had been opened. In an attempt to avoid the rough hand of justice, the main instigators of the People's Soviet issued this apology video. It didn't work. According to reports I've read, the ringleader, Vyacheslav Zuderman, received a 9-year sentence, while 2 co-conspirators received 7 years each. You might be wondering, why is it ethnic Russians, especially ethnic Russians in Petropavlovsk, who keep expressing these dangerous separatist sentiments? Let's discuss that. The Republic of Kazakhstan is mostly populated by ethnic Kazakhs, who make up over 70% of the population. Ethnic Russians account for only 14%, but this makes them the country's second largest ethnic group, and because ethnic Russians are concentrated in the north of the country, along its 7,000-kilometer border with Russia, there are areas, notably the city of Petropavlovsk, where ethnic Russians make up roughly half the population. This has made Petropavlovsk a potential flashpoint in a sort of culture war. Since independence, the Kazakh government has been steadily replacing Russian language place names with Kazakh language place names, but so far has resisted renaming Petropavlovsk with its Kazakh name, Kazakh. Instead, the city is now officially named Petropavl, which is a Kazakhish way to say Petropavlovsk. This compromise satisfies no one, of course, and most everyone still calls the city Petropavlovsk or Kazakh. It was a comment on a Tik Tok post on this topic, the renaming of Petropavlovsk, that Tatiana L. received her 5-year sentence for in February. I can see both sides of this issue. I can understand why the Kazakh authorities want to reclaim the old Kazakh names for places around the country, especially as the Kazakh language is growing in popularity at the moment. But at the same time, many ethnic Russians see Petropavlovsk as their city. And when someone wants to rename your hometown, especially someone that you might perceive as an outsider, that's going to stoke tensions. And this relatively minor controversy illustrates why many ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan dream of a day when their part of Kazakhstan can be joined onto Russia. 40 years ago, the ethnic Russians of Kazakhstan were Soviet citizens and were part of the country's dominant ethnic group. Today, they find themselves part of a shrinking minority in a country they did not choose. They did not emigrate. New international borders were imposed on them by outside events. I don't think calls for Russia to annex northern Kazakhstan is a good idea, even if such calls were legal. But I can understand why some old Soviet boomer in Petropavlovsk might find the idea appealing. Whatever the reason, calls for separatism are potentially a very serious problem for Kazakhstan, even when it comes from groups of cranks high on conspiracy theories like the People's Soviet. It's easy to forget this, but the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, the breakaway states declared in 2014 in the Russian-speaking region of Ukraine known as the Donbass, were initially kickstarted by a bunch of cranks high on conspiracy theories. They received support from Russian uber-nationalists like the currently imprisoned Igor Girkin, and eventually started receiving direct support from the Kremlin, but it all started with protests by cranks in Luhansk and Donetsk in early March 2014. The protection of Russian language speakers in those two breakaway states and the wider Donbass was one of the justifications cited by Vladimir Putin for launching the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Is it possible that a similar scenario could someday arise in northern Kazakhstan? With Russia's military bogged down in Ukraine, it's unlikely to happen anytime soon, but Kazakhstan's leadership would be crazy not to worry about this, especially as there have been a string of statements over the years by Russian politicians that question Kazakhstan's legitimacy and its right to the northern part of its country. For example, in 2014, not long after he successfully occupied Crimea, Vladimir Putin publicly questioned the sovereignty of Kazakhstan, saying that its history as a state began in 1991, something Kazakh patriots, who traced their statehood back to the 1200s, took great offense to. In 2020, prominent member of the State Duma, Vyacheslav Nikonov, said that Kazakhstan did not exist before the founding of the Soviet Union and that Kazakhstan's territory was a gift from Russia. The issue erupted again after Kazakhstan's president, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, ruled out ever recognizing the Donetsk or Luhansk quasi-states, as he called them, in 2022 at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. He said this while sat right next to Putin, which is pretty extraordinary. I've made a video about this exchange if you want to know more. For now, though, let's just say that this comment really upset a lot of Russian nationalists. A week after this, State Duma member Konstantin Zatulin, speaking on Radio Moskva, said, "There are many towns with a predominantly Russian population that have little to do with what is called Kazakhstan. I'd like Astana not to forget that, with friends and partners, we don't raise territorial matters and don't argue. With the rest, like, for example, with Ukraine, everything is possible." But the most incendiary remark appeared on the Vkontakte account of former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, which included threats to annex territory from several countries that border Russia. The post referred to Kazakhstan as ex-Russian territories and said the Kazakh government's attempts to settle ethnic Kazakhs in northern Kazakhstan could be classified as genocide of Russians. It then said, "We will not close our eyes to what's going on. Until Russians come there won't be any order." This post was quickly deleted, and Medvedev, a noted alcoholic with a history of making unfortunate social media content, claimed that his account had been hacked. So yeah, I get why Kazakhstan's authorities are nervous, and why they don't want to give either the Russian government or Russian ultranationalists in search of an adventure an excuse to support any separatist sentiment by ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan. We only have to look at what's happening in Ukraine to see why this is so potentially dangerous. But while I'm saying I understand Kazakhstan's response to separatist comments, I think it's probably an overreaction. Speaking to the Times of Central Asia, a researcher on the topic named Dr. Peter Oskolkov argued that separatist sentiment is on the wane, saying, initially, there was a lack of public trust in the prospects of Kazakhstani statehood, especially among Russian speakers. Nowadays, these doubts are absent. Moreover, the overall level of the identification with Kazakhstan and the quality of life have both grown significantly since the 1990s, so the idea of separatism has lost its main appeal. One last thing, it's not just ethnic Russians that the Kazakhstan authorities prosecute under these laws against stirring ethnic tension. In June last year, an ethnic Kazakh teacher who was pregnant was tried and convicted after posting Tik Tok videos that publicly insulted people of Russian nationality in an indecent manner. Despite being on the verge of giving birth, she was sentenced to 2 years in prison. That sounds incredibly cruel, but I guess we have to acknowledge that Kazakhstan is willing to be brutal with its justice, whatever ethnic group you belong to. And I guess that's saying something. If you're in Kazakhstan and you're still watching this video, seriously, what do you think you're doing? Stop watching, delete your browser history, and do not share this video with anyone. If you're not from Kazakhstan, please do share this video. And if it's safe, leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe. That would be great. And I'll see you guys in the next video.